Britain and Argentina have been arguing over the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas, for 200 years. And here's the strange bit. The argument is older than Argentina itself. When it started, Argentina didn't exist. Now, every time that England play Argentina in either the football or the rugby, someone will bring up either the islands or the War of 1982. Well, fair enough. But the war was not the start of this story. It's a lot older than that. So, where did it start? Well, with the French, obviously. 300 miles from Argentina, 8,000 miles from Britain, the Falkland Islands, and there are 778 of them in the archipelago, are about half the size of Wales, or for my US viewers, about the size of Connecticut, with a population of just 3,600, smaller than many English villages. Various early mariners claim to have sighted them, Spanish and English, but it was a Dutch sea captain, Expelled de Viet, who made the first undisputed sighting in 1600. Indeed, for the next 100 years, the islands were referred to as the Expelled Islands. Fast forward to 1690, and Captain John Strong of the Royal Navy made the first recorded landing on the islands, and named the waterway separating the two largest islands the Falkland Sound, after Viscount Falkland, one of his bosses back in England. And that name, Falkland, then started to be used to refer to the islands themselves. Now, at this stage, no one claimed sovereignty of the islands. They simply became a safe harbour for ships passing around Cape Horn and sailing the southern oceans for whales and seals. One group of sailors who frequented the island were Frenchmen from St Malo in Brittany. Incidentally, a port that legend has it was named after the Welsh monk who brought Christianity to the region back in the 6th century. The sailors gave the islands another name, Île Malouine, the island of the St Malo men. The Spanish translation ended up as Malvinas. So there we go. The name that Argentina fights for today is actually derived from French, from a Breton port, named by tradition after a British Welsh monk. History's great, isn't it? And it gets even better, because it was the French, not the British or the Spanish or the Argentinians, who formed the first settlement on the islands. In February 1764, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville founded Port Louis on East Falkland, settling Acadian refugees displaced from what is now Nova Scotia in Canada, following France's defeat during the 7 Years' War with Britain. Now, just as an aside, Bougainville appeared in my most recent episode all about the real siege and massacre behind the story Last of the Mohicans. And here he is again, just prior to becoming the first Frenchman to circumnavigate the globe. In this age, anywhere the French went, their bitter rivals, the British, were swift to follow, even to some desolate, windswept islands right down in the South Atlantic. Just 11 months later, January 1765, Commodore John Byron landed at Saunders Island, just off the top of West Falkland, and, apparently unaware of the French presence on East Falkland, proceeded to claim the entire archipelago for Britain. And later that year, Captain John McBride established a British settlement at nearby Port Egmont. It seems that the two European settlements coexisted for a period in complete ignorance of each other. Okay, so we have a potential clash between British and French interests. But how have we got to the current situation with Britain and Argentina both claiming sovereignty? Well, that started in 1767. Whilst past its heyday, the Spanish Empire in the Americas, which had its seeds in Columbus's voyages in the late 1400s, was huge. Back in 1494, the Pope had divided the non-Christian world, i.e. everything outside of Europe, between Spain and Portugal, using a line about 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. The Portuguese got everything to the east, hence their empire in Brazil and various colonies in Africa and Asia, while Spain got everything to the west, thus their dominance of modern-day California all the way down to modern Chile and Argentina. The French, and in particular the Protestant nations like the Netherlands and Britain, never accepted this papal division of the world. For the English, and later the British, ownership rested on discovery, occupation and settlement. Nevertheless, to Madrid the islands fell very much in their sphere of influence and control, as dictated by the Pope 250 years beforehand. But they had another, far more practical reason for wanting the French and the British out. The islands were the gateway round Cape Horn, and behind Cape Horn lay the silver of Peru. If other powers controlled the islands, then that wealth of the Spanish was threatened either by rival navies or by French or British pirates. They now applied pressure on France, whose king happened to be the cousin of their own. It was this family, as well as strategic interests, that had resulted in both countries fighting and losing to Great Britain in the 7 Years' War. The French now handed Port Louis to Spain, and the settlement was renamed Puerto Soledad and administered from Buenos Aires. Bougainville was personally compensated, and the settlers were given the choice of leaving or staying under Spanish rule. The majority chose to leave and were repatriated to France aboard Bougainville's own ships, and many ultimately ended up in Spanish-ruled Louisiana in the 1780s, the ancestors of today's Cajuns. So that's another rabbit hole for you. Whilst a small number stayed on in Puerto Soledad, the French colony as a community effectively dissolved. One down, but the Spanish still had to deal with the British settlement. On the 10th of June 1770, a Spanish expedition from Buenos Aires, under the orders of the governor, consisting of 5 ships and roughly 1,400 soldiers, landed at Port Egmont. The tiny British garrison, numbering just 140 men, was totally outnumbered and surrendered without a fight, and they and the tiny settler community were sent packing. When news reached London, there was a public outcry and Britain mobilised the Royal Navy for war. The Spanish mobilised in kind, and their king looked to his French cousin for support. However, when King Louis XV demurred, the Spanish were left in a tight spot. Fortunately, they found a way out. The governor, down in Buenos Aires, had applied that papal ruling, but without bothering to refer to Madrid. So, in January 1771, the Spanish ambassador in London, Prince Macerano, issued a declaration on behalf of his government, disavowing the expedition and offering to restore Port Egmont to the British, whilst expressly stating that the restoration did not affect, quote, the question of the prior right of sovereignty. In other words, the British could have a settlement, but the old papal sovereignty remained. The British government accepted their restoration and re-established their settlement, whilst not acknowledging Spain's claim. However, they didn't explicitly counter that with a claim of their own. A nice diplomatic fudge all round that allowed both sides to climb down without a war, well, until 200 years later. A rumour circulated at the time that a secret verbal promise accompanied the deal, that Britain would evacuate the islands after a face-saving interval. No written proof has ever surfaced, and historians still argue about it to this day. Especially as in 1774, the British abandoned the settlement due to economic reasons. Or was this the 3-year face-saving secret deal? If it was, then what happened next muddied the waters enough for Britain to continue to claim sovereignty. The garrison left behind a lead plaque declaring the islands to be, quote, sole right and property of King George III. A deliberate legal marker that possession was being just suspended, not surrendered. In international law terms, this is an assertion of animus, the intention to retain title even without physical occupation. At the time, it didn't seem to bother the Spanish. The British had gone, and any claims, well, they could be kicked down the road. For the next 37 years, they administered the tiny settlement at Puerto Soledad, mainly consisting of a tiny garrison and a penal colony from Buenos Aires. This unbroken Spanish administration is a core plank of the Argentine case for sovereignty. During that period, they created the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, based at Buenos Aires, the administrative unit that the independent United Provinces, later Argentina, would later claim to have inherited. Now, many of you will be aware that during the Napoleonic Wars, there was a period when Spain was allied to France. After all, it was a Franco-Spanish fleet that Nelson destroyed at the Battle of Trafalgar. As part of that war, The British decided to attack Spanish possessions in South America, and in 1806 and 1807 they tried, unsuccessfully, to seize Buenos Aires. Denied the city by local juntas, this intervention helps explain the Argentine emotional inheritance of Britain as the old aggressor, adding fuel to the whole Falklands-Malvinas debate. A few years later, 1810, a local uprising deposed the Spanish viceroy and established de facto independence. The new state claimed everything Spain had governed from Buenos Aires, an inheritance that on paper stretched from the silver mines of Bolivia to the penguin colonies of the South Atlantic. In practice, that inheritance was already breaking apart. Uruguay, Bolivia and Paraguay all forged separate paths. All that was left of the large viceroyalty were the United Provinces, sort of centred around Buenos Aires in the north of modern Argentina. They also laid claims to the rest of Patagonia, the southern part of what is now Argentina, and of course the disputed Falkland Islands or Malvinas. Speaking of which, in 1811 the Spanish garrison at Puerto Soledad was withdrawn, and they, like Britain in 1774, left a plaque asserting Spanish sovereignty. For nearly a decade, the islands were left to the penguins, wild cattle and visiting sealers and whalers. And it was those sailors and whalers, mainly British and Americans, who witnessed the frigate Heroina sail into what had been Puerto Soledad and Port Louis before that on the 6th of November 1820. Captained by Colonel David Jewett, a Connecticut-born privateer, the frigate was acting under a Buenos Aires letter of marque, with permission to raid Spanish ships who were still trying to reassert control over their South American empire. In fact, Spain never formally recognised Argentinian independence for nearly 40 years. Jewett's voyage had been a disaster. Months at sea had yielded little, the crew were ravaged by scurvy, there was a mutiny he had to suppress, and his one significant prize was a Portuguese vessel, which was legally dubious to say the least, since his commission specifically covered Spanish vessels. The seizure of the Portuguese vessel actually moved him from privateer to pirate. Nevertheless, he now landed, raised the flag of the United Provinces, fired a salute, and told the bemused whalers that they were now under the jurisdiction of Buenos Aires. Interestingly, he later fell out with Buenos Aires and ended up fighting in the Brazilian Navy against Argentina. Now, whether Jewett acted under government instructions is disputed. No documentary evidence has ever been found, and Buenos Aires reportedly learned of the action from foreign newspapers. Official or not, it did reflect their view that they were the inheritors of the old Spanish claims. A few years later, they granted fishing and cattle rights on the island to Jorge Pacheco and Jewett Vernet, a Hamburg-born merchant of French Huguenot descent. After a failed 1824 attempt, Vernet established a working settlement at Port Louis from 1826. His settlers came from many nations, including British, Irish, Germans, and Gauchos and Charrua Indians from the mainland. While still claiming that their 1774 plaque underlined their sovereignty to the islands, Britain did recognise the United Provinces via a treaty of friendship, commerce and navigation in 1825. Argentina stresses that subsequent events were a violation by Britain of this treaty of friendship. The British have always argued that their claim to the Falklands was made decades before the treaty and has nothing to do with it. See how complex this thing is? In 1829, despite that treaty, tensions mounted when Buenos Aires appointed Vernet civil and military commandant of the islands. Britain's consul, Woodbine Parish, immediately lodged a formal protest, 19th of November 1829, asserting British sovereignty. And just when you might be thinking that we've moved from potential British versus French and Spanish to British versus Argentinian potential conflict, in step the Americans. In mid-1831, Vernet seized 3 American sealing ships for breaching his fishing regulations. The United States refused to recognise his authority and called him and his men a band of pirates. On the 28th of December 1831, the USS Lexington arrived off the Falklands and in a brief raid destroyed the settlement's defences and arrested several senior settlers, carrying them off in irons to Uruguay. The captain of the Lexington, Silas Duncan, now declared the islands free of all government, and Washington, by the way, never paid any form of compensation. Whilst the demoralised settlers were effectively left leaderless, and some took the opportunity to leave the islands, a rump remained and were left to their own devices for nearly a year. Then in late October 1832, Buenos Aires sent French-born Major Mestivier at the head of a garrison to re-establish their authority. He arrived with 26 soldiers, plus 11 women and 8 children, but within weeks this latest Argentine effort was falling apart, and it had nothing to do with the British, or at least not yet. At the end of November, his own soldiers mutinied and murdered him. With the situation starting to get out of control, and with the settlers looking on, not knowing what to do, the captain of the ship that had brought them, Lieutenant Colonel Jose Maria Pinedo, who was still anchored offshore, landed to restore order. Almost at exactly the same time that mayhem was breaking out in the Argentine settlement, the British, after 58 years' physical absence, arrived to reassert their own claims to the islands. On the 20th of December 1832, Captain John James Onslow, in the brig sloop HMS Clio, arrived at derelict Port Egmont, repaired the old fort, and erected a notice of possession. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 2nd of January 1833, HMS Clio anchored off Port Louis, or Puerto Soledad, and Onslow informed Pinedo that he had come to, quote, exercise the rights of sovereignty, and requested that the Argentine flag be struck and the garrison depart. Pinedo now found himself in the same position that the British themselves had in 1774 when faced by the Spanish. Outgunned and with no orders to specifically resist, he formally protested, but then complied. The following day, a British party landed, and without any great battle or any bloodshed at all, hoisted the Union flag over the Falkland Islands. They've remained under British rule, apart from a brief period in 1982, to this day. Pinedo sailed for Buenos Aires with his garrison, their dependents, and a handful of settlers. Despite some claims that the pre-1833 settlers were all expelled, the evidence suggests that Onslow encouraged them to stay, and many did. Charles Darwin, during his famous voyage on HMS Beagle, visited the islands just 2 months later, and hired 2 of those settlers to help in his work. Meanwhile, another pre-1833 settler, Antonio Roxa, died a wealthy landowner in 1869. Their descendants have been absorbed into the present-day community. Argentina counts it differently. 70% of everyone living there in 1832 was gone within a year. The majority of the current population, they point out, is largely derived from settlers arriving after 1833. So who's right? Well, that depends entirely on who you ask. Ask Buenos Aires, and they inherited these islands from Spain. 37 years of Spanish governors, all run from their city. Britain walked away in 1774 and stayed away for 6 decades. And then in peacetime, between 2 nations that had signed a treaty of friendship, a British warship expelled their garrison. They protested within days, and they've never stopped. However, ask London, and Britain got there first. First landing, first settlement, before a single Spaniard, let alone Argentinian, stepped ashore. And that plaque of 1774 wasn't a goodbye, it was a bookmark. When Buenos Aires appointed a governor in 1829, Britain objected immediately. Not a shot was fired in 1833. Many of the settlers stayed, and their descendants, nearly 2 centuries on, voted 99.8% to remain British in a referendum in 2013. So it's a lot more complex than simply shouting chants at a football match. With so many points and counterpoints, and so many passions on both sides, this 200-year debate looks likely to rumble on for many, many more years to come. It's a perfect case of all of us being prisoners of our histories. If you want to learn more about British history, and indeed get more of the History Chap, then please do sign up for my newsletter or get exclusive talks by becoming a patron. There's a link to both in the description below. Thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to sharing more great stories from British history with you very soon.